In today's video, we are diving into the life of Princess Alice of Battenberg. Does not ring a bell? Well, she was the mother-in-law of Queen Elizabeth II and as such the mother of Prince Philip. We will look at her family, her marriage, and her illness during which she was forcibly put in a mental clinic, losing all ties to her family. Lastly, we will dive into her later life as the mother-in-law of the Queen. Victoria Alice Elizabeth Julia Marie was born on February 25, 1885, in the Tapestry Room at Windsor Castle. She was the eldest child of her parents, Prince Louis of Battenberg and Princess Victoria of Hesse and by Rhine. Through her mother, Alice, as she was called, was a great-granddaughter of British Queen Victoria. Her father was the product of a morganatic marriage, through which the House of Battenberg gets their roots from. Alice's christening took place 2 months after her birth in Darmstadt, Germany. Darmstadt is also the place where Alice grew up, albeit only partially as the family traveled between different countries due to her father's naval career. From an early age on, Alice's mother noticed her difficulties while talking. She had problems learning it and had difficulties pronouncing words correctly. Eventually, Alice was diagnosed with congenital deafness. With the help of her mother, young Alice eventually learned to lip read and speak in English and German. Later in life, she would even learn French and Greek. Alice grew up with 3 younger siblings, Louise, George, and Louis. Louise would later go on to become Queen of Sweden through her marriage to King Gustav VI. Their childhood was mostly spent with their many royal relatives. Alice also was a bridesmaid at the wedding of the later George V to Princess Mary of Teck. Shortly before her 16th birthday, Alice's great-grandmother, Queen Victoria, passed away, and Alice was one of the many attendees of her funeral at Windsor Castle. A year after the Queen's death, the coronation of King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra took place at Westminster Abbey. While attending, Alice met Prince Andrew of Greece and Denmark. The two would marry in a civil ceremony a year later, on October 6, 1903. From then on, Alice was known as Princess Andrew. Both were closely related to many of the ruling houses of Europe. As such, their wedding became one of the greatest gatherings held before the outbreak of the First World War. After the wedding, Alice became involved in charity work. 1.5 years after their wedding, the couple's first child, Margarita, was born. 3 more daughters would follow until 1914. Their last child and only son, Philip, was eventually born in 1921. Greece was marked by years of political unrest during the 1910s. The Balkan Wars, which started in 1912, would be the first of few wars Greece would participate in for the next decade. During this time, Andrew, who had been in the army previously, was reinstated, and Alice took up work as a nurse. For her duty, she was awarded the Royal Red Cross by British King George V. When the First World War eventually broke out in 1914, Alice's brother-in-law, Constantine I, initially tried to remain neutral. Eventually, in 1917, he was overthrown and the Greek royal family were forced into exile. Among them, Alice, Andrew, and their children. During this uncertain time, the family mainly resided in Switzerland. By the end of the war in 1918, Alice found many of her close relatives murdered. Among them were her aunts, Tsarina Alexandra Fyodorovna and Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna. Her uncle Ernest Louis, the Grand Duke of Hesse, was deposed, and the Russian, German, and Austro-Hungarian Empire had fallen. Alice's brother-in-law was eventually put back on the throne again in 1920. The family was as such able to return to Greece. However, another war later, the family found themselves fleeing the country. This time they settled near Paris. Alice spent her time working in a charity shop for Greek refugees. It was around this time that Alice began showing first signs of her later illness. She began claiming that she was receiving messages and that she had healing powers. Eventually, she was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia. After receiving the news, her husband Andrew forcibly put her into a mental clinic in Switzerland. Alice protested, claiming that she was sane, and repeatedly tried to leave the place. During her stay in the clinic, Alice and her husband drifted apart, and all of her daughters married German princes. Her only son Philip moved to the UK, where he stayed with his uncles and grandmother. Alice was released after 2 years and broke off most contact with her family. It was only after the death of her daughter Cecilia that Alice met her estranged husband and son Philip at the funeral. Alice would later claim that the death of Cecilia healed her. She resumed contact with her family afterwards. Alice returned to live in Greece in a small 2-bedroom flat. Soon after, the Second World War would break out, and Alice decided to remain in Athens. She worked for the Red Cross, helping with organizing soup kitchens, and managed to fly in medicine. In addition, she opened 2 shelters for orphaned or lost children. Alice remained in Athens even when the German tanks rolled through. When asked by a German general if there was anything he could do for her, she simply replied, "You can take your troops out of my country." Alice also helped a Jewish widow and her 5 children to hide from the Germans. By October 1944, Athens was liberated, but the fighting continued as communist guerrillas were fighting the British over the control of the capital. Shortly after, Alice received the news that her husband, whom she had not seen since 1939, had died. Although the fighting was ongoing on the streets of Athens, Alice decided to distribute rations to policemen and children. When warned that she might get struck by bullets, she replied, "They tell me that you don't hear the shot that kills you, and in any case, I am deaf, so why worry about that?" In 1947, Alice returned to the United Kingdom for the wedding of her son Philip to the later Queen Elizabeth II. Some of her remaining jewels have been used for the engagement ring of Elizabeth. Alice sat on the north side of Westminster Abbey opposite King George VI, Queen Elizabeth, and Queen Mary. Her surviving daughters, however, were not invited due to the anti-German sentiment after the Second World War. In 1949, Alice founded a nursing order of Greek Orthodox nuns named the Christian Sisterhood of Martha and Mary. In 2 tours she made through the US in the 1950s, she raised funds. After her daughter-in-law Elizabeth ascended to the throne in 1952, Alice attended the coronation, which took place a year later. For the occasion, she wore a 2-tone gray dress and wimple in the style of her nun's habit. In 1967, Alice left Greece for the very last time, following the colonel's coup. By then, Alice was 82 and her health began to fail. She was invited by her son Philip and Queen Elizabeth II to stay at Buckingham Palace, an offer which she accepted. Alice died there 2 years later on December 5, 1969. She was buried in the royal crypt in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. However, shortly before she died, Alice expressed a wish to be buried in Jerusalem. This wish was eventually fulfilled on August 3, 1988, when her remains were transferred to the convent of St. Mary Magdalene. Alice rests there near her aunt, Grand Duchess Elizabeth Fyodorovna, who was murdered by the Bolsheviks during the Russian Revolution.